Eventually, the United States and Canada ended up in a trade war. The countries that were once the closest allies have now become adversaries. On August 22, 2020, the United States and Canada were in the middle of trade negotiations. At that time, Canada became furious at the excessive demands from the United States and ended up walking out of the trade talks altogether. As a result, the negotiations ultimately broke down. First, let's take a look at what the United States was demanding. Although the exact details haven't been released, according to various media reports, the United States first demanded trade rights from Canada. So, the United States demanded that Canada would need American approval whenever it entered into trade agreements with other countries. In addition, the US interfered in cultural policies related to French-speaking regions of Canada, such as demanding the discontinuation of French labeling, the protection of Canadian beer, and the cessation of subsidies for French culture. They also demanded joint management of the mining and export of critical minerals, or even that the United States should have complete control over them. They also demanded that the minimum threshold for duty-free purchases from the United States be lowered. As you can see, these were demands that essentially infringed on Canada's sovereignty. Of course, we need to wait and see for more accurate details, but considering that Canada was so angry that they walked out of the negotiations, I think the demands from the United States must have been very similar to what we've discussed, especially when the United States demanded Canada's sovereignty. Canada decided that further negotiations were meaningless and ultimately chose to enter a trade war with the United States. In fact, many people felt that the United States was making excessive demands, and there was also the opinion that this is no longer the age of imperialism. There were also many opinions like that. If Canada were to accept this, it would essentially become a colony subordinate to the US economy, unable to escape that fate. In fact, it would be worse than just becoming the 51st state. Some even say that Canada is being forced into an economically subordinate position. Because of this, a trade war eventually broke out between the United States and Canada. The Canadian government decided to impose retaliatory tariffs of up to 50% on US products worth $20 billion, or about $27 trillion, one starting from August 25. They decided to impose retaliatory tariffs of 15%, 25%, and 50% on about 700 different items. These tariff measures have been applied since September 8th. This is a countermeasure against the United States, which imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian products worth $20 billion, starting from August 22. The Canadian government explained that the purpose of this measure is not so much to increase tariff revenue, but rather to protect Canadian businesses and reduce imports of American products. François-Philippe Champagne of Canada, the finance minister, said that we did not choose this conflict, but when economic integration is used as a weapon rather than as the foundation of a mutually beneficial partnership, we must stand up to it. He also said that the government even used strong language, calling the policy to defend sovereignty a war after seeing this conflict. In particular, Canada is taking measures targeting products that can affect certain US states. Soon, there will be midterm elections in the United States. At this time, they are trying their best to target the Trump administration. They are aiming at processed cheese from Wisconsin, seafood from Maine, and washing machines and dryers from Kentucky in an effort to put pressure on the Trump administration. Especially Maine is a place where the Republican Party is particularly sensitive. In fact, Susan Collins, a Republican senator who is seeking re-election, criticized the Trump administration's tariffs on Canadian products as a mistake after Canada implemented its own tariff policy. Especially, products like blueberries, potatoes, lobsters, and lumber produced in Maine are often processed in Canada and then brought back into the United States. If Canada imposes tariffs during this process, Maine is bound to suffer severe damage. Canada is also being mentioned as possibly restricting the export of electricity and critical minerals. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, warned that they could cut off the export of electricity and key minerals supplied to the United States. If this happens, American cities near the Canadian border are bound to suffer. However, it doesn't seem like this trade war will end easily. President Trump has already announced that starting in January 2027, a 50% tariff will be imposed on Canadian cars and parts. Of course, we should also take a look at the White House's position. The White House stated that Canada has exploited the United States for decades, and President Trump will no longer tolerate this. Last week, the White House said that the United States has been more generous to Canada than to any other country on Earth. They proposed and announced significant tariff reductions on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber, while restricting preferential market access. Canada, instead of a partnership, chose unreasonable demands, flip-flopping, and outright rejection, according to the statement. They also pointed out that over the past 10 years, the United States has seen an average annual goods trade deficit of about $50 billion with Canada. Without the United States, Canada cannot survive. Canada sends 3/4 of its total goods exports to the United States and gets the overwhelming majority of its money and economic oxygen from the US market. President Trump emphasized this while talking about the United States and Canada. He also claimed that they are considering changing Lake Ontario, which lies between the United States and Canada, to Lake America. This is being interpreted as a kind of provocative measure. However, it seems that Canada does not intend to just sit back and take it. With this incident as a turning point, there is a high possibility that efforts to reduce economic dependence on the United States will become even stronger. From Canada's perspective, the most important task is not to cut off trade with the US, but to create a structure that allows exports to be redirected to other markets if problems arise in the American market. This has been Canada's approach so far. Canadian companies found it easy to access the US market, and cross-border supply chains had been established over a long period, so there was relatively little need to actively develop markets outside the United States. However, through this trade conflict, it has become clear that if exports are overly concentrated in a particular country, a single political decision can affect entire companies and industries. Therefore, the Canadian government is likely to pursue market diversification in the future, choosing to expand into regions such as Europe, Asia, and Central and South America. Just as Korea expanded into various markets like Southeast Asia and India when China imposed economic sanctions on it, Canada can make a similar choice. Canada already has the institutional foundation to expand trade relations with countries other than the United States. Especially since the EU is actively trying to help Canada, things may proceed more smoothly than expected. The issue is how quickly the actual trade volume can be increased. The United States is geographically adjacent to Canada and has lower transportation costs, so exporting to other regions is much less convenient. Therefore, rather than looking for a single market to replace the United States, it is more likely that Canada will move in the direction of expanding trade with multiple countries at the same time to spread out the risk. The supply chains of companies may also change. Canada, which currently sources necessary parts or raw materials from the United States, companies may try to secure new suppliers outside the United States, and those that send Canadian products to the US may also review their production and logistics systems to target European or Asian markets. This process requires considerable time and cost. They need to secure new business partners, establish transportation networks, and adapt to each country's standards, certifications, and tariff systems. Therefore, the process of Canada reducing its dependence on the United States is unlikely to be completed in a short period of time. It is likely to take place over several years. What is important here is that Canada is not trying to abandon its relationship with the United States. The US is still Canada's most important trading partner, and considering the geographical conditions and these factors, it is realistically difficult to completely replace the United States. However, while maintaining its relationship with the United States, Canada is trying to increase its trade with other countries to reduce the risk of its entire economy being shaken by policy changes in a single country. If these changes become more pronounced, results that the Trump administration did not intend could occur. The more the United States puts pressure on Canada through tariffs, the more Canadian businesses and the government may feel the need to reduce their dependence on the US market. If the economic ties that the United States and Canada have built over a long period start to become more dispersed due to this conflict, even if the US lowers tariffs again, it remains to be seen whether Canada will rely on the US market to the same extent as before. And this situation is being closely watched by America's allies. The Trump administration is showing a very soft stance toward China and Russia, but is taking a tough stance toward the allies aligned with the United States. Of course, some people sometimes say that the allies haven't really helped the United States properly. However, saying that this amounts to cooperating with rival or hostile countries is a bit misleading. Above all, Canada has cooperated with the United States for a long time and has participated in almost every war that the US has been involved in. However, this situation has shown that even between such countries, trade conflicts can shake security and diplomatic relations. So, in the future, some countries may maintain security cooperation with the United States while also pursuing policies to reduce their economic dependence on certain countries. Militarily, they may move together with the US, but when it comes to key minerals, energy, and semiconductors, strategic industries like batteries, they are building supply chains with multiple countries. This doesn't mean they want to cut ties with the US, but they've realized they can't survive by relying solely on America. From the US perspective, this situation is also bound to become a burden. The decisive reason the United States was able to grow this much is because its allies continued to support it. But now that this trust has been broken, even after the Trump administration ends, the biggest challenge for the next administration will be how to restore this trust. This is a clear example that shows trust built up over decades can be broken overnight.